You know what's funny? We tell ourselves stories about who we are, about what we do when it matters, and then something happens that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. March 13th, 1964, Queens, New York. A young woman comes home from work at 3 in the morning, and what happens next becomes one of the most infamous crimes in American history. But here's the thing. The story you think you know, the one they taught in psychology classes for decades, the one that changed how we understand bystander behavior and urban apathy?
That story is a lie. Or at least, it's not the whole truth. And the real story, the actual truth of what happened that night, is so much more complicated and so much more human than the myth we've been sold. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to 1964. Kitty Genovese is 28 years old. She manages a bar in Queens called Ev's 11th Hour. By all accounts, she's well-liked, hard-working, the kind of person who lights up a room. She lives in Kew Gardens, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood where people know each other, where it's supposed to be safe. On the night of March 13th, Kitty closes up the bar around 2:30 a.m. She drives home in her red Fiat. It's a route she's taken 100 times before. She parks in the Long Island Railroad parking lot about 100 feet from her apartment building. It's cold, it's late, the streets are mostly empty. And this is where everything goes wrong. A man has been watching her. His name is Winston Moseley. He's 29 years old, married, father of 2, and works as a machine operator. By day, he's a regular guy. By night, he's something else entirely. And on this particular night, he's been driving around looking for a woman to kill. Think about that for a second. Not rob, not assault. Kill. He's driving around with the explicit purpose of finding someone to murder. And Kitty Genovese, coming home from an honest day's work, becomes his target purely by chance. Moseley parks his car and follows her. Kitty notices him, starts walking faster. She's almost at her building when he catches up to her and stabs her in the back. She screams. She screams for help. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. And I mean interesting in the most disturbing way possible.
2 weeks after Kitty's murder, the New York Times published an article. The headline? 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The article, written by Martin Gansberg, describes how 38 people witnessed Kitty Genovese being attacked over the course of 35 minutes. How they watched from their windows as she was stabbed multiple times. How not a single one of them called the police until it was too late. 38 witnesses, 35 minutes. Nobody helped. The article sends shockwaves across America. It becomes a defining moment in how we understand urban life, human psychology, and moral responsibility. The term Genovese syndrome enters our vocabulary. Psychologists develop entire theories around what they call the bystander effect, the idea that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to help because everyone assumes someone else will do it. The story becomes a parable about the death of community in modern America, about how cities turn us into callous monsters who can watch someone die and do nothing. It's referenced in textbooks, in TV shows, in countless think pieces about what's wrong with society. There's just one problem. It's not true. I mean, the murder happened, obviously. Kitty Genovese was very real, and she died horribly. But the story about 38 witnesses doing nothing, that's fiction. Or more accurately, it's lazy journalism mixed with police assumptions, mixed with a city's need for a scapegoat. So what actually happened that night? Let's break it down, because the truth is somehow both less damning and more tragic than the myth. When Winston Moseley first attacks Kitty, she does scream, and someone does hear her. A man named Robert Moser opens his window and yells, "Let that girl alone." And you know what happens? Moseley runs away. He literally runs away because someone intervened. So right there, the idea that nobody did anything is already falling apart. Someone intervened, and it worked. Kitty gets up, she's wounded but alive, and she stumbles toward her apartment building. But here's where geography and bad luck conspire against her. Kitty doesn't make it to the front entrance. She's injured, she's disoriented, and she stumbles to the back of the building, into a vestibule that's out of sight from most of the apartments.
And Mosley, who fled the scene, comes back. He finds her there, in that enclosed space, and that's when the second, fatal attack happens. Now, did people hear things that night? Yes. Did some people look out their windows? Absolutely. But here's what they saw: darkened streets, unclear shapes, confusing sounds. Remember, this is 1964. No streetlights like we have now. No clear sightlines. And the second attack, the fatal one, happened in a spot where almost nobody could see it.
One witness, Sophia Farrar, actually goes down to help Kitty. She holds her as she dies. But by the time Farrar gets there, by the time anyone calls the police, it's too late. The injuries are too severe. So where does this 38 witness thing come from? Here's the kicker: the police. The police are the ones who told the Times that 38 people witnessed the attack and did nothing. And why would they say that? Because they're embarrassed. Because they took too long to respond to the calls that did come in. Because it's easier to blame the community than to admit their own failure. And the Times? They run with it because it's a hell of a story. 38 people watched a woman die is a much better headline than confused witnesses in chaotic situations failed to prevent tragedy. One sells papers, the other doesn't.
The reporter, Martin Gansberg, never actually talks to the witnesses. He takes the police commissioner's word for it and writes an article that will define a woman's death for the next 60 years. But wait, it gets worse. Because once the story is out there, once the narrative is set, nobody wants to contradict it. The witnesses who did try to help, who did call the police, they're ignored or disbelieved. The actual facts of the case get buried under the weight of the myth. And the myth is powerful because it confirms something we want to believe about ourselves and our society. It lets us feel superior, like we would have done something different. It gives us a simple explanation for something complicated. It turns a tragedy into a morality tale.
The psychological research that came out of this, the bystander effect studies, a lot of them are based on this false premise. Don't get me wrong, the bystander effect is real. It's been demonstrated in controlled settings. But using Kitty Genovese as the foundational example, that's building a theory on quicksand. Here's something that really gets me. Kitty's own family spent decades trying to correct the record. Her brother Bill Genovese made a documentary called The Witness, where he investigates what actually happened that night. He interviews people, he looks at the evidence, and he systematically dismantles the myth. And you know what's tragic? Most people still don't know. The lie is more famous than the truth.
So let's talk about Winston Moseley for a minute, because he's the actual villain in this story, and somehow he gets less attention than the supposed 38 witnesses. Moseley was caught 6 days after killing Kitty, and when the police arrest him, he confesses, not just to Kitty's murder, but to 2 other killings. He describes the attacks in detail, shows no remorse, talks about it like he's describing a hobby. He tells police he killed Kitty because he wanted to kill a woman. Not for money, not because he knew her, just because. He's a serial killer before we really had a term for it.
During the attack on Kitty, he stabbed her, sexually assaulted her, and stole $49 from her wallet. The whole thing took maybe half an hour from start to finish, and Kitty fought. She fought hard. The evidence shows she struggled. She tried to escape. She did everything she could to survive. Moseley gets the death penalty, which is later commuted to life in prison. And here's something that'll make your blood boil. In 1968, while being transferred between prisons, he escapes. He breaks into a house, ties up a man, and rapes his wife before being recaptured 5 days later. He stayed in prison until 2016, when he died of natural causes at age 81. He never expressed real remorse. He never acknowledged the full horror of what he'd done.
But here's what bothers me most about the Kitty Genovese story. By focusing on the witnesses, we make Moseley less important. We make the story about us, about society, about bystanders, and we forget about Kitty herself. Who was Kitty Genovese? She was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was in a long-term relationship with a woman named Marianne Zilanko, something that wasn't widely reported at the time because it was 1964, and that wasn't the kind of thing you publicized. She loved animals. She was saving money to go back to school. She had friends who cared about her. She was a person, not a morality tale. And by turning her death into a parable about urban apathy, we erase her humanity.
The real lesson of the Kitty Genovese case isn't about bystanders. It's about how we construct narratives, how we prefer simple stories to complex truths, how we let myths persist because they're useful to us. Think about how many times you've heard someone reference the Genovese case, how many psychology professors taught it as fact, how many articles have been written using it as evidence of societal decay, and all of it based on a lie that a lazy reporter printed and nobody bothered to fact-check for decades. It makes you wonder what else we think we know that isn't true. What other stories have we accepted without question because they fit our preconceptions?
The truth about that night is messy. Some people did hear things and didn't react quickly enough. Some people heard things and thought it was a domestic dispute and didn't want to get involved. Some people did try to help. Some people called the police. The police response was slow and inadequate. And one man, Winston Moseley, made a choice to kill someone for no reason other than he wanted to. None of that is as clean as 38 people watched and did nothing, but it's true. And here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. We still do this. We still take complicated tragedies and flatten them into simple narratives. We still let the first story we hear become the definitive story, even when evidence contradicts it. We still prefer myths that confirm our biases over facts that challenge them.
Kitty Genovese deserved better. She deserved better that night in 1964, and she deserves better from history. She deserves to be remembered as a person who was murdered, not as a symbol of everything wrong with society. Her death was a tragedy caused by one violent man and a series of unfortunate circumstances. That's it. That's the story. It's not as satisfying as the myth, but it's the truth. And maybe the real lesson here is that we need to be more skeptical of the stories that satisfy us too easily, the ones that make us feel smart for understanding them, superior for knowing we'd behave differently. Those are usually the ones worth questioning.
The next time you hear about 38 witnesses doing nothing, you'll know better. The next time someone references Genovese syndrome, you can correct them. The next time a story seems too perfect an example of human failure, maybe dig a little deeper. Because the truth matters. Facts matter. And Kitty Genovese, the real Kitty Genovese, the woman who lived and worked and loved and died on a cold night in Queens, she matters more than the myth we made out of her death. That's what we owe her. That's what we owe ourselves. The truth, messy and complicated as it is. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. If you want more deep dive true crime stories told with detail and respect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. A new case is coming soon.